All right, kia ora koutou. Thank you for joining us for our first campus seminar for 2022. So first up for the seminar, we've got our Director of Campus speaking, Dr. Barry Milne. So Barry is, of course, our director, as I said. He has a background in psychology and psychiatric epidemiology, though I guess you could call yourself a quantitative social scientist now. His expertise is in life course research and working with survey and administrative data. And today he's going to be talking to you about one of the biggest administrative databases that we're working with, the integrated data infrastructure, how that's used, how it can be used and what its usefulness is, as well as some, I guess, next steps of what is needed with the data as well. So I will pass on to Barry. Thank you.
Thank you, Steph. Okay, so yes, I'm going to talk today about the integrated data infrastructure, which is now turned 10. It was set up in 2011, and people started using it soon after. And I thought now is time to take stock, and we at Compass have been using it probably the last 7 or 8 years, so we're relatively early as far as academics go in getting involved with the IDI. And so this talk is kind of in 3 bits. Firstly, explaining what the IDI is. Secondly, talking about what we've learned in the first 10 years of the IDI. And third, my view on what some issues are that we need to solve, or at least think about. And I should point out that, and I'll get to this a little bit, but the IDI is used not just by academics, it's used more by government and also by non-government researchers. And so the views you're going to get today is from someone who's very much an academic researcher. And I would probably have different views if I was working for government or working for a non-government agency. So I'll just put that out there right now. So yeah, so 3 sections. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the IDI is. Okay, so the IDI, integrated database containing confidentialized microdata about peoples and households. So basically what it is a lot of administrative data that's collected in New Zealand when you use a hospital service, when you collect a benefit, when you get arrested for something, when you get a degree, when you get NCA, that's all collected by the individual agencies. And what the IDI does is brings them all together and links them together at the person level. For most tables. So for some tables, there may be linkage at the household level. Basically what you have there is an ever-resident population. So it's a population of people who've been born in New Zealand since 1920, paid tax since 99, or arrived in the country since 97. It's a longitudinal data set. So the data sets themselves, they started when the data sets started to be collected, and you can follow them ever since. The other aspect there is it's intergenerational, potentially, so you can link between parents and children. Okay, so this kind of summarizes a bit here. What we've got here are the different sectors that we've got data collected from, and all linked together at the individual person level. So we've got benefit and social services. And also here what you see, if you can see this, although the font is quite small, is you've got the dates from which each of these data sets are collected. Another thing to note there is there's a lot of health data in there. That wasn't the first thing that went in the IDI. It was probably a couple of years in. But there's a lot of different health data sets there. All of these start at a different point and are followed longitudinally. So for instance, let's pick one there, the mortality collection since 1988, and you've got all the records in the mortality collection since then. Okay. So I mentioned this before. What they have at the center of the IDI is a thing called the spine. And what the spine is the central concordance table really of the IDI. And you can only be linked across these different data sets if you're in the spine. So I alluded to this before. The spine is a collection of people, a union of people who are either born in New Zealand since 1920, have arrived here on a visa stamp since 1997, or paid tax here since 1999. Everyone is in population, the IDI at the moment is about 10 million people. So that's double what the New Zealand current population is. But again, you've got people who have come in here, who have moved out, who were born and then died, etc. So you've got the 10 million people. There are ways to be a New Zealand resident, just as an aside, and not be in there. So for instance, if you were born in New Zealand and haven't yet paid tax in New Zealand, but arrived from a country that doesn't require a visa stamp, such as the realm countries in the Pacific. So if you're a child, for instance, you may have records in each of these data sets, but you will not be in the spine. You cannot be linked across. So you may find a person in the education data set, you won't be able to link their records to anywhere else in there. But for the most part, it captures people who are resident in New Zealand. Okay, in terms of the history of the IDI, and thank you here to Michael Challens, who sent me a slide summarising this. So the 2011, as I said, it started in 2011, that was the IDI prototype. And to some extent, the IDI can be considered as a prototype that grew. So it hasn't been reconstituted at all. It was a prototype and it's just been added to as it's gone along. So initially, there was very much a labour market focus to allow linking of individual household and business level data sets, had the following components at that point: the longitudinal employee and employment and education data set, migration and movements data, and the longitudinal business database. So as I said, very much a labour market focus, and since then, different data sets have been added on. And initially, when they started to add to the prototype, there was the initial privacy impact assessment about the privacy implications of using these data for research. And then there was a cabinet decision to expand the IDI under the Better Public Services proposal. And since then, wherever they added a new tranche of data, often it was just from one sector, but sometimes one or two sectors put in at the same time, they did an additional privacy impact assessment. And they did 7 over a 3-year period from 2013 to 2016. And then they thought, this is getting silly, we're going to do an overarching privacy impact assessment, and that happened the year after that in 2017. And then whenever new data is added, they undergo this data ethics and privacy assessment, which you can get to the link there. And so recently they've added data on COVID, and there was a lot of work going on, both to support the COVID response. Sometimes it's about who's getting a wage subsidy, other times it's about immunisation, etc. Okay. The 5 safes is a safety framework that Stats New Zealand uses for its microdata, really, in which IDI is one package of its microdata. So the idea there is, if you want to use the IDI, you get assessed as a person. So that's the safe people part. So you put an application, I'll get into the application process shortly, and they assess you. You send in your CV, you send in, if you're a new user, you give 2 referees who can vouch for your ability to analyse data, and they assess that you're a person who can use this safely and is not going to do anything nefarious with it. They also assess your project, that it's a public good project and can be done with the data. Safe settings, that's, you can only access the IDI through things called data labs. So you can't access it from your home computer, for instance. Data labs, there's various around the place at Stats New Zealand offices at Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and at various government departments in Wellington. I think there's most data labs in Wellington, and then at various universities. Here there are 3, one at Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences, one about 50 metres that way in the Public Policy Institute, 4 here in fact, one in engineering and one over in the stats department. And I'll get on to issues later with the 5 safes framework that I think may be causing some issues. Safe data, so as I alluded to earlier, it's a confidentialised database, so they strip off all identifiers, name, address, individual agency IDs. So you don't, people say, is the NHI in the IDI? And the answer is no, there's no national health identifier number in there, or your SWIN number from Benefit, or whatever the PRN number is it from crime. They're not in there. There are things that map one-to-one to them for individual agency IDs, but not the actual IDs that the agencies use. They also strip off days of birth. So you get month of birth and year of birth. Full date of birth in New Zealand is relatively disclosed. There's only 200 people, roughly, with the same date of birth in New Zealand. So once you stratify that by another variable, region, for instance, you're often down to a unique individual. So except for very specific purposes where mostly to do with early childhood, where you really needs to know the exact day that someone was born. You don't see that information. Staff output, you're in the data lab, you're working away, you can see the data sets that sit on the Stats New Zealand server. You can't transfer any of that to a memory stick or off there. You work away, you ask for your results to be confidentiality checked by Stats New Zealand, and that process takes, they say, 5 working days, but often longer, sometimes shorter. And then they send it to you via email, and at that point it's yours to use in reports and share with whoever you like. Okay, so application process used to be any time you could put in these applications, and that got to be a bit much. So there's now a 6-week deadline. The last deadline was just last Friday. I put an application in. You describe the project and describe how it's public good research. You list the researchers. If there are new researchers who haven't yet used the data lab, they have to be confidentiality trained. You list the data that you want to use for your specific research questions. If it gets approved, they then unlock the data sets just that you have asked for. Okay, so the IDI has, I should know the answer to this question, has a number of, a couple hundred tables, and maybe your research question only accesses 10 of them, for instance, and they only unlock those 10. And then there's the Ngā Tikanga Paihiri framework, which is relatively new, the last 18 months, 2 years. It's been in the IDI application form. I think another thing to point out is the application forms are changing all the time. So never use one you've used before, go straight to the website to find it. You need to describe your experience working with the populations of interest. Show evidence that the populations of interest support the research and have been and will continue to be consulted about the research. So for instance, we did some research showing that mental health hospitalizations raise the risk of dementia. And as a result of doing some reading around this, we discovered that there's a bit of research out there on infections and dementia. And so we put in an IDI application to investigate that. And we involved Alzheimer's New Zealand as part of that research process. And I've had 2 meetings with them. And you talk about the value of the research, the populations of interest, and any potential risks there are to the populations of interest and how they'll be managed and mitigated. Okay, so that's what the IDI is. Let's talk about what we've learned about the IDI over the past 10 years. And I say this is coming from me, an academic researcher with my own point of view about the IDI. First thing is, it's popular. So this again is from Michael Challens as well at Stats New Zealand. This is a number of approved microdata projects that Stats New Zealand has given over the past 10 years. And when the IDI first got underway, there was only a handful of applications that, 2012, handful of applications that asked for IDI data. Mostly it was for other things, and the other things might be census data. So for instance, where Compass probably asked for the census data in 2012 to use and went into the data lab to use it. Then after a while, it started to dominate. So that by 2016, 90-ish% of all the applications that went in were for integrated data. That's mostly the IDI, sometimes the longitudinal business data set. But basically, it's the main show in town now from a microdata point of view at Stats New Zealand. Next thing to say is that there's a lot of reports coming out now. Now this has become a bit of an obsession with me over the last 3 months. But I, and with the help of other people at Compass, have put together, as far as we can tell, all the papers and reports that we can find that have used IDI data, and put them into a bibliographic database. You can find them on the Virtual Health Information Network website as well. And we did some sort of intelligence on this in terms of the number of reports that have come out. So this shows the cumulative number of reports that have used IDI data since it began in 2012. And you can see several things here. One, especially early, it's dominated by government researchers, still dominated by government researchers. As far as we can tell, and I should say that we've certainly missed some. We've found all that we can, going to the government agency websites and using Google Scholar as well as the normal academic channels to find these things. But I'm sure we've missed some. But as far as we can tell, this is the number of reports that have come out from different areas. So government dominating early, but also quite a few by non-government agencies, particularly MOTU, doing a lot of research in this, as I'll get onto shortly. But then after a while, 2016, 2017, you're starting to see more and more being done by academic researchers. That's the grey band there. And also, and this is something that we added in sort of latterly, the number of theses coming out now using IDI data. 31 now, a lot. I think half of those were in 2021. Anyway, so 489 in total over a 10-year period. So basically on average, one a week. Well, a report a week is coming out using the IDI, as well as other things that we haven't counted. So government put out these sort of infographic thingies that I haven't counted as part of this. Just focusing on my area, the journal articles, now 135. When I used to do this by hand and thought, oh, there's about 30 articles. That was about a year ago, probably you'd asked me. So about 30 articles have come out using the IDI. Far more than that once we went searching. And actually in 2022 now, there's been the equivalent of one a week come out just in journal articles. They're going to some quite high profile places. So most articles are published in international journals, which is not surprising because there are very few New Zealand journals. But also they're going to good journals often. So impact factor is basically an indicator of the average number of citations a paper published in a journal gets in a one-year period. And I don't know what the average is, and it's very skewed. So some papers get 3,000 citations and others get one or none. On average, over the whole time that journal articles have been produced using IDI data, the median impact factor of the journals is 2.7. In the last 2 years, those 58 in the last 2 years, it's 4.6. And there's been 7 publications in like really quality journals with impact factors of greater than 10, and 23 in pretty good journals with impact factors greater than 5. So it's hitting some good places. Okay, another thing here, and this is a little bit of a pop belief. Well, pop belief. There's certainly a view with some justification that the IDI was set up to support the social investment approach. Don't think it was set up to support the social investment approach, but rumours I hear, and I'm not in government, so I don't really know, is that it was the increase in data sets going into the IDI was driven by the fact that you could run a social investment approach, which was the flavour of the month of the previous government, national government there. So the idea there is if you identify people who likely have problems later, you can, on the one hand, depending on who you talk to, save money, or on the other hand, save them, help them out by knowing who's going to have bad outcomes in the future. And so there's a belief the IDI is largely used for social investment projects. So what I did is I went back to that database and had a look at the years 2015 to 17, so the last term of the previous government, which had the social investment approach, and saw how many looked to use a social investment, take a social investment approach. And actually there are only 10, and I've listed the 10 there. And they're also listed at the end of the presentation, which we'll share online afterwards. Many done by the Treasury. But point is, there are 97 other things that were done in 2015 and 2017 that didn't seem to take a social investment approach. Now, I may have missed some things or misclassified some things. Other thing to point out is that some of the work with the IDI using a social investment approach may not have produced a report, or at least one that anyone could find. So there was a number of liability-based microsimulation models that were running at the time. I can't find too many reports about those. So they did something with those. So I'm not saying there wasn't a social investment approach taken with some IDI work, but there's a lot of other stuff going on as well. And so publications cover the diverse areas, and I've listed ones that I could sort of glean from looking at those nearly 500 publications. And to some extent, this represents various agencies and places sticking to their knitting a little bit. But there's a lot of labour market work being done by sort of employment and wages and income, being done by MOTU and MBIE, AUT through Gail Pacheco's team at AUT, and a little bit done in Victoria. Productivity work also done by MOTU and MBIE and the Productivity Commission. Work on education, Ministry of Education, obviously, a little bit my motto, a little bit by the New Zealand Initiative. When you get to the health stuff, it's mostly been done by the universities. There's not a lot done by the Ministry of Health itself in there. And that's us at Auckland, Otago and Massey. Housing, you've got Philippa Howden Chapman's team at Otago doing a lot of work there. Also some stuff being done by MBIE and Social Wellbeing Agency, some stuff on wellbeing by Motu Treasury, Social Wellbeing Agency and universities. Deprivation stuff done by Dan Exeter here at Auckland, and a little bit in the socio-economic space by us. And more recently, some COVID work being done by Tupunaha Matatini. I'll show you an example very shortly of that. And then there's a number of Stats New Zealand publications in there that focus on sort of the methods and how you can construct administrative population using these types of records and various other bits and pieces, as well as other bits and methods work done by various people. Okay, so I'm going to show you some, I think, good examples of use of the IDI in the next few slides. Okay, so some work done on COVID. This is Stephen Turnbull and Dion O'Neill, Emily Harvey, I think, and other people at Tupunaha Matatini, constructing this thing called the Aotearoa Coincidence Network. So looking at transmission risk in different small areas in New Zealand, SA2, so suburbs size areas of 2,000 to 3,000 people. So what they did is they worked out areas that have lots of connections where individuals go to the same workplace or go to the same school. And where they could find that, they said that this is a high and transmission risk place, and they split transmission risk into three, low, medium, high. And what they also did is constructed a health vulnerability index by the number of long-term conditions of people in those areas and the number of elderly people in those areas. Split that into low, medium, high to form this sort of 9-square grid with different colors there. Okay, so the bluer you are, the higher transmission risk of the area. The redder you are, the greater health vulnerability that area has. And if you're purple, you've got both. And then they mapped the whole country this way, and they broke the slide of the graphic I've shown on the right-hand side here is of the 5 main centres in New Zealand, and you see several things here. One is that Wellington's got a ton of areas with high transmission risk, but not a lot of health vulnerability risk. Dunedin, on the other hand, has the greatest with both, interestingly. Okay, this is another good example that I often show when I present work about the IDI. This is by Jeffrey Donovan, who was a visiting fellow from, I think, somewhere in the States, and Joan Dowles, who's at Massey. And what they wanted to do is see if the vegetation that you're surrounded by increases your risk of asthma. And I like it because of how they've used different parts of the IDI and also introduced stuff to the IDI. So they used birth records initially to find people who were born in 1998. Then they looked at, there's an address table in the IDI which captures as best it can where people have moved address. It's always delayed because it relies on you telling an agency that you've moved. But anyway, it's there. And what they did then is they classified where people lived across an 18-year period. And then using satellite imagery, and I think a few other things, they looked at the greenness of the areas surrounding you. This NDVI is a normalized difference vegetation index. And they also did other things looking at how the extent to which you're surrounded by natural land cover or exotic conifers or gorse. And then they looked at asthma based on whether you've got pharmaceutical scripts for asthma, 4, 7 or 10, or whether you've had a hospitalization diagnosis for asthma. And what you see here, and my little red thingy probably doesn't work on the screen, it doesn't, is that you're protected against asthma if you're surrounded by natural land covers or diverse species, whereas your asthma risk is increased if you're surrounded by conifers or gorse. So introduced species, interestingly enough. And then here's another paper here by Berry et al. And group at University of Otago, Wellington, I think. And I like this one because it shows what you can do with a very, very small population. So here, it would take a lot of effort to get together a population of very preterm births and find out about their education later, which is exactly what they did here. They were able to identify them in the IDI track them for 20 years and see what the education outcomes were. And these are very, very preterm children, so children born at 23 to 24 weeks. And the basic results here were that most of the children, 2/3 of them, survived to age 10, and most were able to participate in school and perform well, some of them, but also that, so they didn't just have the 20, because you've got the whole population, they didn't just have the 23 to 24 week group, they've got all gestational ages, and they're able to show a gradient of school achievement right up to early term. Okay, so this is some interesting examples of how the IDI has been used. And now this is kind of a segue slide into sort of things you have to be aware of a little bit with the IDI. I think it's interesting and useful to compare the IDI results to collected data, because the IDI only contains a certain type of data and it may have its own issues and biases. I got my PhD actually and worked for many years on the Milne study, and they've produced maybe 1,200 reports, probably more now. And I think to myself sometimes, if they just had access to the type of data that the IDI has, how many of those publications could have been done? And I reckon it's probably about 10 out of the 1,200. So collected data is still important. So here, and this is work that Steph did with her student Charlotte Svardell, looked at depression and pregnancy using an indicator of whether or not people are on pharmaceutical medications. And what you see there is a very stark ethnicity gradient where European mothers are more likely to get antidepressant medication than Māori mothers, Pacifica mothers, and Asian mothers. And this is pretty much what you can work with the IDI. You could look at hospitalizations, but that's not going to add much to that. You could look at people who are getting community care for mental health, but that's also not going to add much to that. We do not have any information in the health records generally on primary care. Let's compare it to the Growing Up in New Zealand study and who meets screen for the Edinburgh Depression Inventory, which is a depression and pregnancy inventory. And you see several things here. One, a lot more people are depressed than you would think, just looking at people who are getting medication. Two, the ethnicity patterns are far different. And three, the ratio of getting medication to being depressed is far higher in European and other groups. So if you look at the reds, you'd say that European is maybe 5 times the depression in maternal depression or depression in pregnancy risk than Asian, but it's about the same if you look at the EDI. So IDI is great for some things, but you just have to be aware what the data mean. Okay, I'll just finish off this section talking about what I consider to be the strengths and weaknesses based on work I've done in the IDI and other things that I've seen from what other people have done. And this is part of a paper forthcoming in the Journal of Royal Society of New Zealand about longitudinal research in Aotearoa, New Zealand using the IDI, where I was asked to put together a SWOT matrix. So this is the top half of the SWOT matrix. So strengths, its whole population. This transmission risk paper was based on the 2018 census, 4.7 million people, which is enough numbers to get a good estimate for each of the SA2 areas. And what it also means you're able to study small and difficult to reach populations. So the preterm babies are variable, and then there's some work being done on refugee children that Arazu here is also doing on refugees, that Charania et al. At I think FMHS has done some work there. Again, difficult to see how you could study that group by a study which you implemented yourself. All life stages are able to be studied. So it's an ever-resident population from just born, pregnancy actually, until people die, 80, 90, 100. And I've given 2 examples there, but there are many examples, especially I think in the academic space, of cross-domain exposures and outcomes. We're looking at an exposure in one area, which may be health, and an outcome in another area, which may be education, for instance. In terms of weaknesses, this one at the top is one that I focused on just before. It's primarily service use data. It will not include problems and issues for which services have not been sought, and they're not the same thing. And I particularly focus on the mental health area here, where a lot of people with mental health problems will not be seeking services, and they will be invisible from an IDI point of view. Even those who seek services, there may be biases in who receive services or who seek them. So if there are any access biases, they're going to be represented there. That's one of the reasons I think the IDI isn't particularly good for looking at, depending on what your phenotype is you're interested in, looking at time trends over time. Again, going back to the mental health example, if you show that's been increased in service use over time, what exactly does that mean? More services made available, more people got problems, you just don't know, or a combination of both. So they interpret with care. It's government surveillance data to some extent, so it's deficit focused. So the government only really gets involved when something's gone wrong, mostly. There are things in there like income and education, which are not necessarily deficit focused, but most of the stuff in there is you access the service when something's gone wrong. Limited follow-up for many data sets, as I showed in an earlier slide. Data sets, the earliest ones are there's the birth records going back to 1840, but other than that, there's the health records, hospitalizations, mortality starting in 1988. Most everything else starts in the 2000s. But on the flip side, it means every year that goes past, there's greater things that you can do with these data because they're a year older. Variable data quality, these data sets weren't collected for research purposes. Largely, they're accounting data sets mainly, just a count of things that have gone on in those particular sectors. And the documentation, there's been reliance on the individual agencies supplying them to Stats New Zealand, and they're still not very good, and they're also hard to find outside of the IDI. It's difficult, and people have tried this actually, it's difficult to determine family and household structures longitudinally. So you get snapshots of the census. The census 2013, 2018 is in there. 2018 had lots of problems, but it's in there. But they're the best ways you can determine family and household structures. Outside of that, you have to guess, and you've got the address changes, but that's updated at different paces by different members of the family, so it's a bit difficult. And something I didn't touch on earlier actually is it's based on linkage, mostly probabilistic linkage, and so sometimes it's wrong. I've got a student now, Eileen, working on missed and false links in IDI data and the biases they may be causing. We early on in the project, but I would suggest the mislinks are probably, the false links get the ones focused on, right? We want to minimize the links that are wrong. But I think they're probably causing fewer problems in the mislinks. There's fewer of them. And because the threshold's so high to get in there, actually the difference in characteristics that might cause bias aren't that great between those who are in and true and in and false. If that makes sense. Okay, so now moving on to what I consider to be issues that need to be addressed, sometimes in ongoing fashion, with the IDI. The first big one, I think, is social license for the IDI. That is the permission given by the public to make decisions about management and use of their data, essentially. It's the public's data that's in there. All your data are in the IDI. And if you bumped into someone on the street and asked them about the IDI, I'm not sure how many would actually say they know about it. Okay? If they did know about it, what would they think? I'm not sure, but the point is they don't know about it, and that needs to change. So there's been lots of research in the sort of social license space, not so much in the social license space, specifically about the IDI. So there's a claim made by a couple of researchers that public acceptance for secondary data use is there when there is transparency about how the data are being used, and there's trust in the institutions. So Stats New Zealand occasionally does this research about how much they're trusted, and they're fairly well trusted, but not a lot of people actually know about their services, let alone the IDI specifically. So the Nielsen survey in 2020, I think it was, found that 40% of adults didn't know enough about what Stats New Zealand does generally to know whether or not to trust them. So that has to change. I had an exchange with Len Cook, former government statistician, about the data and statistics bill, for which there were submissions about. And one thing he included in one of his submissions is there was a lot of talk about administrative data, but they never actually mentioned the IDI specifically in the data statistics bill. He suggested that they should, amongst other suggestions that he made. I agree with him, if only because it would get a better known, be talked about more. Perversely, I think the fact that we've just gone through a pandemic and people have seen the use of data for to support the pandemic response actually probably means the public's slightly more educated now than they were, say, 3 years ago. But it's an issue I think it needs to be addressed. And this one's an ongoing one. Social license can change over time. The second one is ethics. So ethical governance of the IDI is uneven. And by uneven means that no one's entirely sure what they have to do, and depending on who you are, you may do something different from someone else. So the researcher's understanding of their obligations and the research, so it depends on the researcher's understanding of their obligations and of the sector or employer that the researcher has. So me as a university researcher, when I first started working with the IDI, I wrote to this was 7 years ago, whatever it was now, wrote to the ethics committee and said, do you think I need ethics for this? And the person, was it ethics committee or just the local ethics advisor? And the person wrote back and said, this is interesting, this just looks like secondary data analysis. I don't think you need ethical approval, which I wasn't happy about. And I seek ethical approval from all the projects that I do. My reading of the ethics guidelines for the Health and Participants Ethics Committee at the University of Auckland suggests that you should put in the ethics application. They say that secondary data may not need ethics application depending on what was told the people whose secondary data was collected about what was going to be done with it. Yeah. Anyway, no one's forcing anyone at the university to get ethics for these things, but at least at the university you've got ethical governance systems in place. Government researchers, depending on what department they're in, they might have the systems in place and they might be required to use them. I've heard of people working on an IDI project thinking, I think I need ethical oversight of this, but not quite knowing where they can go to get that. And I was part of a workshop a couple of weeks ago in which we discussed these issues and the importance of setting up something that could be used for this across the board. And then if you're a non-government researcher, what do you do? Do you have ethical governance systems in place or not? And if you don't, where can you go for them? And a particular ethical issue, I think, here is, I would argue, that there is not informed consent for the use of these data. When you go to a service, you may have signed something that said, that had a little clause at the bottom that said, my data may be used for scientific or research purposes. You may have noticed this, you may not. You may not care because you want that service. You're going in to get the service. You're not going in to produce data for a researcher like me. So I think whatever consent there is under duress because you want the service. And moreover, it's unclear to me, and I think a lot of research needs to be done in this area, and I'm not the person to do it because it's not my methodology, but what the public understand by research for scientific purposes. Again, if you ask someone on the street, they might say, well, you know, the number of people who have been in a hospital for more than 3 days in the past year or whatever. Not that I will link your data from here, 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 and here, and make a model from it, which is what's been happening with the IDI. Ethical researcher Lessoff says that the important question regarding use of administrative data without informed consent is whether an individual's health, interests, or confidentiality could be affected negatively. I would argue that the use of IDI is unlikely to affect someone's health, and I think confidentiality is guarded by the 5 safes. But are people's interests adversely affected? I think that's where you need a diverse panel and an ethics committee to decide these sorts of things. Another issue is Māori data sovereignty. That's the idea that Māori data should be subject to Māori governance. One of the issues, several issues here, one of the issues, and I should say I'm no expert on this either, but one of the issues here is the big data divide, where those represented in the data are often not those using and benefiting from data use. And related to this, in relation to public good, is not all members of the public benefit equally from research that is being done. And I think this may be affecting Māori in New Zealand, overrepresented in data sets, and not using, I can tell you now, not using the IDI as much as non-Māori New Zealanders. And the point made by Roe et al. In relation to Indigenous data sovereignty generally is that the data that's collected is structured to respond to government priorities, not to benefit Indigenous populations or nations. And to that extent, he raises the issue of community level consent, which has a lot of things going for it. One being that compared to individual consent, I think this is actually possible to get. Whereas I don't think you can go back to everyone and ask for their consent about this data that you supplied when you went to the hospital 5 years ago. Can we use it when we do analysis, please? But getting overall community level consent might be possible. The Ngā Tikanga Paihiri framework goes some way to address these sovereignty concerns, but does it go far enough? Other frameworks, for instance, go further. So this Manitoba multi-generational cohort, they've got a process where you need ethics approval generally anyway, but for data sets where Indigenous populations are overrepresented, you also need approval from the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba and the Manitoba Métis Community Research and Ethics Protocol. So I think there's a question there more than anything else. Is the current governance arrangement of the IDI the best way to recognise Māori data sovereignty? I think it's a discussion that needs to be had. And finally, and this became, it's always been apparent, but it became more apparent to me during COVID, is the inequality of access to these data. Insofar as they've got value, only a small number of people can get that value or can do the analysis on the data. So it's a very high bar because of the 5 safes and the safe people and the safe settings to access the IDI. So many communities who may benefit from the IDI data are not able to access it. So another instance of the big data divide. Now this was highlighted during COVID because here in Auckland, we were locked out of the data for a long time. So we couldn't do a lot of the analysis they wanted to do. People in Wellington were chugging away doing stuff. Inequality, but of course, in normal times, people outside of Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and Dunedin and Hamilton can't access the IDI because they're not near a data lab. And communities in the Waikato there may be some interesting research questions they have about their community they can't answer because of the 5 safe people and self settings. Moreover, analysis that was done in 2017 at Stacks New Zealand shows that most uses of the IDI are really simple ones, like just counts, how many people have eggs. So you can do far more complicated things, but most of the uses are actually just counts. If that's the case, I wonder if a technical solution is possible. Such an extension of the nz.stat, we can go there and look at breakdowns of census outputs by various things. That allows a broader access to the data, so anyone can get to it from a machine. Yeah, so you're relaxing the safe people, anyone can do it, you're relaxing the safe setting, they can do it anywhere. You can still have safe projects because you limit the sensitivity of the data that's there, that they can do cross tabulations on. But it allows more people to explore the data and answer questions relevant to them. One of the projects we worked on a few years ago was Auckland Independent Statutory Board, which is the Māori board within Auckland Council. And they approached us to do research, basically just to get wellbeing indicators for Māori in Tamaki Makaurau. And I'm not sure we did a particularly good job in the end, but the thing that occurred to me when we were doing that is, why should they have to approach us to do this? I mean, it's data about the population of Auckland. Why isn't it not made it more readily available to people? And a 2 birds with 1 stone thing here, I think, is there's a claim that the more the public knows about the data, the greater the trust and support or social license for the data use project. And I think what better way to learn about the data is to get people to use it. And they can see the benefit of it and they understand it. And then that the research that's being done represents the community views and aspirations that they have, rather than just the views of researchers like myself. So just to finish up here, just some final comments. I've talked a little bit about the IDI and its value and some issues with it. So, as an academic researcher, I think the IDI is a fantastic research tool. 90% probably of the research we do here at Compass involves IDI research, maybe more, well, no, probably 90%. We do other things as well. And it allows research to be done that cannot be done in any other way. To that extent, it's fantastic. As a New Zealander, however, I want the public to know more about the IDI and to raise some issues about it. Maybe they love it, maybe they think it's great, but we don't know, and we should know. So the New Zealand public needs to know more to discuss its benefits and risks, to have a say in the research that's being undertaken, just going back to my previous slide, and to perhaps participate in the research people. Anyway, that's what I had to cover. Thank you very much.
Barry, do we know if how representative the spine is? Are there any important groups that are left out of the spine?
The spine should be pretty good. As I say, there's the people who don't make it in because you don't need a visa stamp to come in New Zealand, but the spine pretty much should cover I mean, you're born in New Zealand, you pay tax in New Zealand, or you're right here on a visa stamp, that should cover pretty much everybody. So I don't think that's an issue. I think the spine is pretty good. And they did this thing. I was part of the panel that assessed the quality of the 2018 census data. And they come up with a thing called the Estimated Resident Population IDI SURE or something, which was the subsetting of the IDI spine to people who they were sure were in the country at the time of the census. And that showed pretty good numbers against other estimates of the resident population. Peter.
Yeah, on the THB, one thing that's been utterly frustrating is there's no population register. It's accurate, and it seems extraordinary. We've got this IDI system with all the cross-cutting linkages and so on, and yet we don't have an accurate register. Is there any way in which these two will ever be able to meet? Why is it they haven't been, or is that beyond your remit?
That's probably behind my remit in terms of who makes the decisions, but I mean, there is again, well, one thing I didn't touch on, there's no, maybe the point before as well, you have to make a guess at the population at any one point in time. And they've got ways to do that based on essentially, does it seem like you're in the country and are you using services? And if you weren't using services, maybe you're not in the country, that sort of thing. So that's the only way to do it, but that can be broken down to geographic areas such as DHBs. So you can go in there and look at the statistical geography and get an estimate of the Auckland DHB population at any one time. So it's possible, but and the other health data that DHBs hold within the IDI, and actually the administrative population census, that may actually have stuff. If you Google that, Christine Bycroft put it together with the team at Stats New Zealand. They might have published numbers for that. If you just Google that, and maybe the published numbers by DHB. Okay.
Should we take some from the chat?
There was a bit of discussion around ad hoc data loading, so loading your own data into or other data into the IDI, and we had Caitlin Henderson actually fielded that rather well in the chat. I might just read out what she said about that. Users can request new data to be linked to the IDI, what we call an ad hoc data load. Because of the large demand for adding new data and our restricted capacity to do so, especially in the last 2 years when capacity was taken up by adding COVID-related data sets, these requests go through an application and prioritization process that assess the work involved and how much benefit the data set would bring to the wider user community. So then there was a following question on wanting to add an ad hoc data set. I'm assuming that requires consent for the linkage. So it could be one way to understand if the public or patients know what is happening. And so that, I remember we've had discussions about that in the past, and of course the delays currently being experienced around ad hoc data sets. Is there details on the Stats New Zealand website, do we know?
Yeah, there is. In fact, that link to the data ethics and one of that slide that's got the privacy impact assessments on it, at the bottom there's a link. If you go there, that's where you can find about adding data to the IDI, but Caitlin knows. There's a delay there. Consent, they will ask about consent. So you're right though, that's, and there has been a little bit of work done. What do I think about my health data being integrated into the IDI, which slightly speaks to the social license side of things. And Pauline Gulliver did a bit of work on that. Again, general support, but a variety. So some people want it and some people don't want it.
Right, there was a question on what was the project that was looking at the health vulnerability of the elderly? I mean, it must have been one of the ones that you...
That's so there's a Turnbull paper. So the final reference there, and again, this was, they got funding from various places, but was part of the COVID response. So to fit them all on 2 slides, I've made the references quite small. But that Turnbull paper there came out a couple of 3 months ago.
Okay. Len Kirk had some interesting words. Given the richness of the IDI, I'm surprised at the limited use made of it. The UK Data Archive gets about 100 times that. and the Dunedin study papers compare with this. While the problem is one of awareness, my own experience suggests that analytical competence in New Zealand is much lower than in the UK. Do we need a strong set of training programs as in a scaled up Compass program? And of course, you mentioned, I think, I'm not sure before, if it was during or before, but yeah, we have an introduction course through the VHIN, and then we have a 4-day course now teaching SQL. Through the VHIN, we have sort of been trying to get further courses, but the difficulties lie in getting anything that looks like the RDI outside of Stats New Zealand, and otherwise being of use if we can't do that. Anything else to add there, do you think, Barry?
No, I think, look, there's only and this comes back to my point about inequality, there's only a couple of hundred people who are able to use the RDI in New Zealand. We're all working on it at the moment. So the capacity is an issue there, and that probably is, there would be more productivity if we had greater capacity. But again, for a lot of things that are being done with the RDI, do you need the level of skill that most people have who are using the data? Possibly not sure.
Well, as you said, a lot of the stuff coming out is just looking at simple tables of counts. So, yeah, again, possibly not.
Right about that catch-22. So we teach an RDI course. What we can't do is take people into the RDI. To do that, we have to set up a project. It's a public good research project. Put all the course members on that project, and then show them within the RDI, and book out a data lab for the day. It just doesn't work. We've had lots of discussions over the past 5 or 6 years about this.
How can community-led data that iwi and Hapu have, be studied beside IDI data?
That's a good question. I think I think there's the basic sort of government services used by people belonging to certain communities and certain iwi that can be produced by analysing IDI data. And then you need to do some data collection yourself. So we've done work with Ngāti Hawa, Martin, haven't we?
Yes.
A survey on the Papakainga survey, looking at the housing of that particular iwi. Something that we couldn't get from the RDI. But yeah, I mean, it also comes back to my point that the RDI contains a lot of things, but it doesn't contain everything. And one takeaway, I think, from my talk should be that you can't do everything with it. There's still lots of interesting research questions that require data that you'll never find in the RDI. Well, another example there, we did a report, Steph was involved, Nicola was involved, Andrew Spore was involved a couple of years ago on constructing a strengths-based community level wellbeing index for Māori. And we reviewed the frameworks of Māori wellbeing and come up with sort of synthesis of that. And our conclusion at the end is, if you really want to measure things this way, you need to do some data collection. You can't use already existing data to measure wellbeing in that way. So, some of the things that you really want are not measured in the way that you want in the RDI.
Okay, the last thing I'll just read out, just following on from the discussion around ad hoc data loading and basically public engagement. At least we are asking about public engagement questions, the academic issue. I suspect that government departments don't think about this, or maybe the public expects government departments to have access to the data. This is Paula Lorgelli. I have been involved in this in the UK with a link to the BMJ. Just health records, but if it was enriched with education and tax and benefits, New Zealand could be punching above its weight in a similar system. Do you know anything about those?
Well, I think we probably already are punching above our weight.
Right.
Because of these data. This was one thing I didn't say is sort of comparisons around the world. And this was some of the things that was raised with the Data and Statistics Bill. New Zealand doesn't have a unique ID that everyone has. For research purposes in the IDI, you kind of do. But in Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, etc., Norway, they've got registers where your interactions, you don't get a different number when you go to get a benefit and get a health service. So that number tracks you across all these places. So there's there's not the linkage required. So those data sets and have been around for a lot longer. And there's another one in Taiwan, and I mentioned the Manitoba one as well. There are other places in the world where you can do similar stuff to this. They're not without their access barriers, though. I think it sometimes takes a long time actually to get access to the Scandinavian data. Where it's relatively, 6 weeks, and you wait 6 weeks you wait 6 weeks for a decision. It's relatively quick in New Zealand for a $500 fee, which I didn't add before. So it's a nominal fee, really. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Cool. Maybe, were there any other questions from?
I just had a quick one more. The government's replacement of the school deciles with this so-called equity index.
Yeah.
I had a quick look to try and find the modelling. I couldn't find it. Do you know if that's been published?
I do not know if that's been published. I know who's involved with it. Again, why isn't it published? I mean, these are the sort of things that they had meetings about, they did a bit of work on, they used the IDI for it. I don't know why you can't find those things. You really have to approach someone in education, I think, to ask those questions. And that was a few years ago who did that work.
Cool, fantastic. Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Barry, for that very informative presentation.